Welcome, Keith, Darcy. Thank you. It's a treat to have Keith here on many levels. We've known each other for several years. Our stories have some eerie parallels and intertwinings, and we found even last night in a wonderful long conversation how deep even more of those connections go. So I think you're in for a treat. That Keith, as the head of the ECOA, Ethics and Compliance Officer Association, has seen probably more things than you could shake a stick at. And in your own corporate career, some 30 years in the financial sector, he can also talk about. He spent time in education, a Fordham graduate, a good Irish Catholic upbringing, spent time trafficking through Presbyterian circles, married a Baptist woman, and have children that are also intertwining these things as well.
Yes.
So Keith just brings a great resume and real life experience and big heart. So thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
What we'll do is I'll ask you a few questions about the conversation. At some point I might open it up for everyone gathered to ask some questions as well. But before we talk about ethics and leadership, which is what this group is about, and the role our faith might play in that, I just want to get to know you a little bit the person. I give a few teasers. So where'd you grow up? Tell me a little about that.
I grew up in the shadow of Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. Had a headmaster in high school who said I wouldn't go very far, so I moved to Westchester. He was at least right on that count. Grew up in a family, I was third generation banker. Grandma was the first. She was an executive in a savings bank back in the Depression and president of the National Association of Bank Women. My father became president and CEO of a small savings bank in the Bronx. And so I was actually born with this costume. It was genetically predisposed, but that was kind of the path that got me started, and it's been a great journey ever since. So.
Well, that's terrific. And fast forward now, you've been married how many years?
38, going on 39.
That's pretty darn terrific. Did you like that cartoon with it?
I loved it. It was great. Yeah, I'm going to get a copy of it, bring it home. My wonderful wife, I was bottom of my class in high school and bottom of my class in college, true story. And
now that takes a lot of honesty in this culture of...
Truly extraordinary. And so as I was a senior at Fordham, I met this wonderful young woman, brunette, who had legs all the way up to her neck, and who would later graduate Phi Beta Kappa Summa Cum Laude. And she was the one that gave me a kick in the ass and said, you better start to study. And I said, oh, that's a good idea. So she was the one that actually got me moving towards my academic interests, and it's been wonderful ever since. We've had a great relationship and continue to.
That's terrific. And she's a teacher?
At Greenwich Academy. She's been there 14 years. She teaches middle school math. And if you ask her what she teaches, she says she teaches people, which I think is very important. She understands there's a larger dimension. She gets young women, for those of you who have had sixth graders pass through, who at the beginning of the year show up with their teddy bears, and at the end of the year talk about their menstrual cycles. So it's quite a transition year, and she's able to create an environment where they come away learning and growing, not just in terms of mathematics, but in terms of who they are as people. So real gift.
And while we in these sessions sometimes get surprisingly open and vulnerable and candid and about our life stories and our pains and our suffering, I can promise you we will not be talking anymore about menstrual cycles. For those of you who are curious. And to the extent you're comfortable, your growing up was not all peaches and cream. I mean, it's a nice little surface story, but tell us a bit about, if you don't mind, some of the dark side. It's not easy.
Well, like all of us, we all grew up in some dysfunctions, and mine was a pretty prototypical alcoholic family. Mother was the most obvious alcoholic. She was passed out at 11 every day. My father was, as a business executive, out every night, and so he didn't come home until midnight, but usually he had his own issues to deal with. And in the midst of that, as a middle child, somehow I became the rescuer in the family. So in order for mom not to drink, I always thought when I was single digits and going into my early adolescence, if I washed, did the laundry, cooked, cleaned, went to the store, if I took all the stress away, that maybe mom wouldn't be the one to clean. So I was the rescuer. And then as I came of age in my early teenage years, in that path of rescuing, I used to take her to AA meetings, dry out clinics, psychiatrists, and finally reached the point where she didn't want to be saved, and I could no longer try and save her. And so you reach a point in one's journey where when people don't want to be saved, there's only one decision that's left for you, and that's to save yourself. And so I had to take that path. And that was painful, not easy. But I did reach a point where I finally had to wash my hands. The family was actually turning on me because I was being so assertive in my interest in getting her finally into the last, what I believed would have been the last hope, the last dry-out clinic. And she didn't want to go. And I just had to say, folks, I'm sorry, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. It's too painful. It's destroying me. And so that was a decision point that I had to make. And now what's interesting about that, because it'll probably lead to the next thing, if you can't save your family, what you wind up doing as a rescuer, you take on another task of rescuing. So I decided to save the world. Now, that's a very big task. It requires a lot of resources and planning, and very, very hard to do. And somewhere in the middle of my midlife crises, immediately after both parents had died within a couple of years of each other, I realized that if I wanted to save the world, I had to save myself. If I wanted to live in a vitalized world, the only controllable I had was to be a vitalized person. And so that's when I stepped away and actually started a deeper faith journey. I already had one.
Yeah. And before we talk a bit about your midlife studies, tell me, as you were growing up, did your in this very difficult time that you're describing, and gosh, my just heart goes out to you. A tough thing to go through as a young boy. Did your faith play a role? Was the church helpful, or was that maybe actually even a problem in its own way?
It had its own problems,
Yeah.
its own complications. The Catholic Church and I, at a point in time, didn't quite see eye to eye. I didn't get as much help and support as I needed. That's another long story, which I won't bore you with. And I kind of felt like I was left alone in this task, and didn't, you're 15 years old. What do you know? You're doing the best you can to try and bring somebody back to life that I could see was dying drop by drop. I mean, literally, bottom of the bottle. And she reached a point where she suffered acute brain damage from excessive alcoholic consumption. She talked in cliches for the last 8 to 10 years of her life. What's it all about, Alfie, was her favorite line. And she just really lost her capacity to live in this world. She was disappearing in front of me. And my father had his own issues, my brother had his own issues, so I was left alone with this rescuing cleanup business and reached a point where I couldn't do it. So the only sane thing to do was to escape, which I did.
Well, there's the Christian faith actually talks a lot also about our own health and our own well-being. In order to help others, you do have to help yourself.
Absolutely.
There's ample stories and passages that talk about healing ourselves and being in a relationship. So you go off, you become this very successful banker. In fact, Keith and I share among some of our stories in common. We each had the same employer, although at different eras and stages. Keith was a senior executive with Marine Midland Bank. You might remember Marine Midland. Of course, now it's part of the HSBC family. I was part of Midland Bank PLC over in the UK, which has been also acquired by HSBC. So Stephen Green, we share in common. So you're one of the top players there, some 15 plus years at the bank, and suddenly you end up taking some seminary courses. Now, what's that about?
Sure. So again, both parents die, and I finally reached a point where I said, I don't have to be chairman of the board just like Dad. That was an interesting revelation. I had a wonderful other career going on nights and weekends as an educator, and I've been an educator for 40 years. Noah Foots is sitting here as one of my prize students, but I had this notion that I really wanted to discover something deeper about life. Both parents died. It's a midlife crisis, call it. So I came home one day from work and I said, honey, I'm 37 years old and I can do anything I want. And she said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I want to go back and get a master's degree. She said, but you already had an MBA. You got that 15 years ago. What do you want to get? I said, well, actually, I want to get a Master's of Divinity degree. And needless to say, she looked at me like I was certifiably nuts. And she said, you're not getting goofy on me, are you? And I said, no, I hope not. And so, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to apply.
It's either that or a red sports car.
It was one or the other. I actually got the red Jeep convertible. That was my version of the red sports car. That's all I could afford, $9,999. So I applied to, and this was actually happening at a time when my mother and I were estranged. My father predeceased her a couple of years before. And I remember, I spoke to David last night, but I had applied to New York Theological Seminary, and my mother passed away, and so we buried her in Woodlawn Cemetery, and it was obviously a bad day because I think I also understood that I was burying my family, that relationships had become so estranged. And I got home that day and went to the mailbox, as people do late in the afternoon, and opened up the mailbox, and there was my acceptance letter to New York Theological Seminary. And the timing of that moment was not lost on me. It is a moment of darkness and an opportunity for light. And so it was like, wow, that was terrific. I also had this unusual experience where, my wife looked at me like I was a little goofy, so I decided, unfortunately, to share this great news. I'm going back to school, I'm going to seminary, I'm going to be a seminarian at nights and weekends. Shared it with a couple of friends, and you had to see the cross-eyed looks on there. They're like, you're what? Are you nuts? You're losing? So as the summer progressed, class was going to start early in August, and the closer we got to the start date, I started to question myself, this is crazy, isn't this? Why am I doing this?
Because you still have your day job.
I got my day job. I have full responsibilities. I'm deputy to the president of the Marine Midland Bank. And so finally the first night comes, and I'm nervous as all get go. And so I go to class, and when I get here,
and I'll bet you looked a little different, or dressed a little different than everyone else.
Totally. There's about 40 people, about 2/3 are people of color, 2/3 are women, and 2/3 are clearly by their garb already professional minister of some capacity. And here's Mr. Wall Street, who lives in the affluent suburbs, sitting in the back of the room, right next to the door, hoping that I can get out the moment I find out this thing is the dumbest idea I've ever gone through.
Some people come to GLF thinking that too.
But it was a fascinating experience because here we are, and the professor finally walks into the room. And he has a book under his arm, and he sits down, doesn't introduce himself. He just sits quietly at the front of the room and allows the silence to fill the room. And then all of a sudden he opens up the book and he starts to read. And he reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void." And as soon as he said, "in the beginning," I get goosebumps just remembering those words, because I could feel a spirit flow through me, and all of my anxieties and concerns disappeared. And I took the most wonderful journey for the next 2 years. Senior executive at the bank by day, and a seminarian nights and weekends. And it was a great experience. Still a very rich part of who I am.
One of the motifs in your life as we've gotten to know each other is a movement from darkness to light, a movement from darkness. And of course, it's a classic biblical concept as well, and you've experienced that in your own life. Also, you said, our guest last month, Kurt Weller, I remember some of you, Kurt said, there are no coincidences. There are no coincidences. And he said when he was younger, he used to think, stuff happens. Well, of course it does. But somehow the faith narrative, the faith interpretation sees that, these coincidences, there's something going on in them. You've had a few of those that you just mentioned. So here you bury your mother, you come home, a chapter closes, a chapter opens on the same day. That maybe in the moment wasn't as obvious, but later it was.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. We talked last night. I had another experience while at the bank. My father died in 1986, and he died basically because he neglected his health. Turn the clock back, when I was 10 years old, I was run over by a taxi in the Bronx and spent about 5.5 months in Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center.
Just say it again, you were run over by a taxi.
Just
make sure we got there.
So you're a real
10 years old.
Yeah, I'm a real New Yorker. It's good. But it was obviously a difficult time. First 72 hours were touch and go. I was bleeding internally. My right kidney was cut in half, and they didn't know that. All they knew was I took about 20 pints of blood, just to kind of give you a sense of that. So, but the doctor couldn't open me up because he didn't think I'd make it off the table. So he basically was betting on two things. He was a kidney specialist, and he thought it might be the kidney that had ruptured, and believed in the healing powers of the kidney, regenerative powers of the kidney, plus my age, my youthfulness, he thought were the better options than trying to cut me open. So, long story short,
what was his name?
Well, I'll get to that in just a second because that's part of the story. And so fast forward, so I had a couple of setbacks, which is why the hospital stay was extended, but Fast forward, there was a time after my father died, within a month, I was going through the anger phase of death. You know, the phases of grief are definitely there. And so this doctor who had saved my life had also done some follow-up research because he found some birth defects that might have caused midlife testicular cancer or sterility. Now this wasn't widely discussed with me, but I was aware of it and had long not thought about it. But now my father's dead, and I remembered that 5 years before he died, this doctor had written to him in 1981 doing follow-up research, basically wanting to know, was I alive that I died, or did I have children, was I sterile? And my father told me about the letter, told me he responded to the letter, never sent me a copy. We weren't on terribly good speaking terms anyway. But I decided, look, I'm not going to neglect my health. I'm going to call this doctor, see if he still works there. Now, I was run over in 1959, so this is 1986 that we're talking, 1987 actually. And so I call the hospital, he's still there. I get his nurse, he's not here right now, I'll have him call you back. So that afternoon I'm on the phone with the chief credit officer at the bank, and my secretary walks in with a note, little pink slips we used to get in the old days. Donovan's on the phone. I worked for Tom Donovan, the vice chairman of the bank. So I said, hey, Frank, you've got to get off the phone. These were the days when we had buttons on phones. Right? So I hit the other button, I said, hello, Tom. He said, who? I said, Tom, is this Tom Donovan? No, this is Dr. Timothy Donovan at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. I said, oh, forgive me if I sound confused, doctor. I thought you were my boss. He said, may I inquire before we get into our conversation, where do you work? I said, Marine Midland Bank. He said, Tom's my brother. The guy who saved my life in 1959, I'm working for his brother in 1987. Just, you know, these moments can't be lost. Coincidences now. Really interesting. So,
You at one point made a trip to Jerusalem.
yes.
Golgotha, darkness. Share that if you don't mind.
With the seminarians, they offered a trip to the Middle East, so it would be Israel and later Egypt. And so I brought my family with me, and we had this wonderful journey, arrived in Tel Aviv, and began to go up north towards Haifa and across the countryside. And about midway through this trip, I realized that we were migrating to Jerusalem. You know, kind of the path and the journey of this was not lost on me. And it was a wonderful, marvelous trip. All the things I had been studying were now coming alive. I mean, you could see the physical places and so forth. And it was really very moving. Every day, every step of every day was quite moving. Finally, we get to Jerusalem, tour around for a day and a half. And now it's the moment where we're going to Golgotha, the place of the skull where the crucifixions took place. We walked through the garden of Joseph of Arimathea. Our guide tells us about these sprigs on the bushes, how they have a healing property, and were probably what is referred to as the sponge that was given to Christ, dipped in vinegar and placed in his mouth while he hung on the cross. And so just kind of, I took some sprigs and for personal reasons, put some healing powers in my pocket and took them home. And then finally we get to the place of the cave and where the burial site is. And at this moment, my heart's racing, and I know that this is what this journey's been all about. And I didn't want to be the first one to go in because I wanted to savor the moment. I didn't want to be crowded out by people wanting to come in behind me. So I waited, and my classmates would go in and they'd come out, and they'd go in and come out. And finally, it's my turn. And the person before me was a classmate, about 35 years old, with her mother, Spanish speakers, both. And I remember as they exited the tomb, the mother said to the daughter in a disappointing voice, "There's nothing there." I don't know whether she was looking to, find a little store where you could buy postcards. But I went into the emptiness of this tomb and realized I had just discovered everything I was ever looking for. In the silence and the emptiness. That the whole time, whatever I was looking for was never out there. It was always in here. It was inside. It was inside the hole of the mountain, but it was inside me. And that's when I came out of that and came home. And about a week later, I said to my wife, "Honey, I'm 39 years old and I can do anything I want." And she said, "What now?" And I said, "I want to quit my career and start a foundation to promote ethics and leadership in business." And she said, "Let's go." And we weren't independently wealthy then. And as Dick Wiedemeyer knows, I'm not independently wealthy now. Dick and I have known each other for 25 years, and he held my hand through many of the dark days. As I used to tell Dick years ago, my wife and I, when we got married, we agreed to live within our means, even if we had to borrow to do so.
Speaking of borrowing and money, so you start this foundation, raise a chunk of money to try to get that going. But 1 month, actually, you were a little bit in the hole when it came time to write checks out.
I went from real money in the bank, and I was funding the early stages of this out of my own pocket, to negative money. And as Dick knows, we used to talk about that. In fact, he said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Are you financially okay?" I said, "Yeah, Dick, I'm okay. It's okay. I can pay the bills." But there was one particular month where I didn't have an ounce left on my credit card lines, any money in the savings bank, and I'm paying my bills on a Friday afternoon. It's 4 o'clock, and I have $4,000 more in bills than I have in any capacity to have cash.
Not good as a banker, huh?
Not a real good place to be.
No.
And so I'm sitting there and saying, just somehow had a feeling something would be taken care of. Phone rings. Pick up the phone. It's my friend George O'Kelly, an attorney from White Plains, a good friend of mine who has since passed away. And George said, "Keith, it's George." I said, "Hey, George, how you doing? Listen, I was just sitting here thinking of you. I just want a big case, and I don't know why I'm doing it, but I'm going to send you a check for $5,000, and you pay me back whenever, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now." I'm just saying, I'm looking at this thing saying, you can't make this stuff up. This is the timing of this stuff. And I was able to pay George back the next month, in fact. And that was a turning point in my work, my vocation, my capacity to sustain ourselves and to grow. And I have continued to live by that. I knew I was going in the right direction, and felt that I was always getting closer to a place where I could realize this and live appropriately. And it just got better. And the more I give away, I find the more it keeps coming back to me. And so I will not waver from that. I'm very clear-minded. I have turned down many very substantial financial opportunities that were not right. And when I left Marine Midland Bank, I was asked if I would stay and be deputy to the CEO and chief administrative officer of the bank, and we'll double your compensation. And I said, "No, thank you. No, I know the path I'm taking. It's very clear." And I've had several opportunities like that. And so I'm not guided by money, I'm guided by the journey.
So most of us here, we're in the game, right? Everyone's in various stages of their career, some rising players, some at the top of the game, some retired looking back. But for those who are still in the game, in the business world, what counsel, what wisdom would you give them to, on the one hand, we're motivated by money, but to not be owned by that?
Yeah.
How do you feather that? Because not everyone is called to leave. I mean, most of us are called to stay as in the search business, or to stay as an investment banker, or to stay as a ditch digger or a construction, whatever we do. That's really maybe where we're meant to be. We're not going to go off to seminary. What counsel, what thoughts would you give?
Yeah, just a couple, because life is not so simple that I could oversimplify this. It's very complex. We all have families we need to support, mortgages we need to pay. We feel the pressures of these things on a day-to-day basis. Kind of two thoughts that I have. One is to stay in place. If you don't like the environment that you're in, you either have the capacity to transform it within your local sphere, or blow the whistle on it if you think it's that egregious, or leave. And that was advice that was given to me by a professor of ethics at Wharton back in the late 1980s in my own career. And it was at a point where I was going to have a career-breaking meeting with the number 2 person in the bank over something that I felt was egregious. And I remember I was counseled by the head of HR. I was so angry, I won't bore you with the circumstances. I was counseled by the head of HR. "Why don't you go home early today? Control yourself, think about it, and if you want to come back tomorrow and punch them in the nose, go ahead and do it." But it was going to. And so I'm driving home, and I used to keep this beanbag of audio tapes in my car with training materials and so forth. Yeah, exactly. What's an audio tape? Yeah, who remembers, right? So I'm driving home on the FDR Drive, and I stick one of these tapes in, and it's this professor from Wharton, and she's talking, and her basic advice was, if you can't transform the system, you either blow the whistle or leave. And I said, transform the system, that's interesting. So on this particular issue, I went back and I said, we have a problem in this company, and I'm going to lead the change process for it. And I said, and God help you or anybody else that stands in my way, because this has to change. This is an unacceptable behavior in this organization. So transformation is one capacity for that. The other thing is, just to complete that question, that thought is, sometimes we can't get fed or nurtured appropriately in our work life, but we may be able to find communities outside of our work life that do, that in fact give us. It could be this organization here. It could be other things that you do. We talked last night, I've always said about leadership, leaders must find moments of Sabbath. You know, the Sabbath in the ancient tradition was a wonderful tradition. It was a day in which you did nothing. All right? You didn't build anything, you didn't create anything, you didn't destroy anything, you didn't eat. You know, it was a day to sleep. It was a day to live. It was a day to dance. It was a day to love. It was a day to make love. But it was a day in which you did nothing. And as leaders, we're overwhelmed by data points that come in all day long from all sorts of electronic devices and everybody who has a problem that they want to offload on us. And so each of us has to find moments of Sabbath, because it's, you know, and certainly take your vacations when you can, but how do you find those? And when I was at Wall Street, I used to 3 or 4 days a week at lunchtime wander over to Trinity Church. You want to be transformed from the busyness of Wall Street, just walk into Trinity Church and look at the stained glass windows and watch people in silence, and it's transforming. You come back a changed person. I find it on the tennis court on weekend. You want to see the real me? Come out in the tennis court on Saturday's Chestnut Ridge Racket Club.
By the way, he is one mean tennis player, in the sense of meaning very accomplished.
But it's interesting. I had a class once. Nona may have been in the class or not, but it was in the same time. And I asked the students, I said, where do you find your moments of Sabbath? And I remember one guy said, oh, and this was a guy who used to fly from Atlanta. He was very intense. Oh, when I listened to John Coltrane, and you could see his body transform when he said it. I had another young student, and she says, well, I run. I love to run. You know, every day I come home, I get my sneakers ready to go running. And she was talking about this running. I do it every night, and I do it on the weekends, twice a day. You know? And finally I stopped. I said, what are you running from? Oh, well, I run from my apartment building to my And so after the class laughed and said, with us, I said, no, what are you running from? And it was about 3 years later, I got a postcard from her from London saying, thank you, I've stopped running.
Wow.
I think she finally got the question and understood and had made changes in her life. So, but we have to find those places where we can get reconnected with ourselves and what's essential and important in ourselves and in our life.
Yeah, I appreciate that. As you know, as you were talking about this wisdom of be part of transformation, fixing the problem, or ultimately whether it's a blow the whistle or leave, those are the options. And you know, you're in good company. Jesus did a little bit of that too.
Sure.
And you know, think about some of the great stories that the many people who came to see him as the Lord. Most of them didn't join his little merry band of disciples and go running around. Most of them, he said, like the demoniac, this person is possessed today, we would say it's sort of some, you know, obviously psychological issue and problems that, so these demons he exorcises, and the guy wants to go with him, the Gerasene demoniac. And she says, no, you go back to what you're doing. The Roman soldier who wants to follow him, he says, no, go back, but just be an honest soldier. Zacchaeus, the tax collector, he doesn't say, oh, come be one of my disciples. He says, no, but just be an honest tax collector, don't be corrupt.
That's right.
So there's this element of stay where you're planted, just do it honorably, and of course the whole message is about transformation of the heart.
The only controllable we have is ourselves.
Yeah.
I can't tell people what to do or how to be it. I don't know. I have a hard enough time myself. So it's about living a life that's a good life, that's a virtuous life. And hopefully somehow that will rub off on other people. But all I can tell you is my story. That's the only story I know. And I said to David and to other people, each of us has our stories. And we not only have our stories, but we are our stories. And when I tell my story, David heard his last night. When we tell our story, you may hear yours. And it awakens us, because what we've discovered through many fine and brilliant minds other than us is that all of our stories are the same. Joseph Campbell wrote about this, famous mythologist, for those of you who may be familiar with his work. If not, Campbell was a professor at Sarah Lawrence College for 38 years, where he taught the history of comparative religions. And Prior to that, he was a hermit in upstate New York after he got his PhD and devoured every book on mythologies and religions and cults and everything from every corner of the world, and produced a 5-volume compendium which recreated every mythology that existed in every age, in every corner of the earth. And he came to a stunning conclusion, absolutely stunning, that all the stories were the same. That the Noah's flood story was 500 years before being told in Central Africa. It's the Gilgamesh story. And 500 years before that in Central China. That the virgin birth appeared in every primitive society. The death and the resurrection was common. He became friends with Carl Jung and began to interpret these mythologies in a psychological sense and realized that there are archetypes to these stories and that all the stories are the same. He wrote 2 groundbreaking books. One is The Masks of God, and the other one was The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, he tells probably the most common myth, which is the hero's adventure. And I love the story. It's typically told through the story of Siddhartha, Hermann Hesse's book. And so in Siddhartha, a young man grows up in a mythical kingdom, as we all do. And one day his parents, at about age 13, take him outside the mythical kingdom. And for the first time, he discovers there's pain and suffering in the world. This disturbs him. Everything was perfect back in the mythical kingdom. So he comes back, and he's so disturbed that he can't reconcile himself with what he's living and what is existing out there. He hears there's a Buddha out there, a brilliant man. He decides he's going to leave the mythical kingdom and meet the Buddha. Now, each of us in our journeys, of course, have moments where we leave mythical kingdoms. We either are called out of it, David into his service, we are unceremoniously thrown out of it, or we choose to leave the mythical kingdom, but this is part of the common journey. So he goes out there and he meets the Buddha, and he says, Buddha, pain and suffering, what are we going to do about it? Now, if you know anything about Buddhas, they only answer questions with questions. So the Buddha answers his question with a question. He says, no, I'm asking the questions here, Buddha. Pain and suffering, what are we going to do about it? Buddha answers again with a question. He concludes the Buddha is a jerk, so he continues on with his journey. And along the way, in his journey, he meets many people, and in each encounter, each illuminates something about life to him. And then finally, one moment, he's in the deepest, darkest part of the forest, and he finds the jewel. And of course, the jewel is a metaphor for ourselves. And he realizes at this moment that the purpose of his journey was not just to find the jewel, but what does he do with the jewel? And he decides he will bring the jewel back to the mythical kingdom and share it with everybody else. That's the wisdom or the illumination of the journey. And as I told David last night, there's a scene just before the end of the book where he comes to a riverbank, and for a period of time he works as a ferry operator. He has a flatbed ferry, and he takes people from this side of the river to that side, from here to there. And each time as they sit on the flatbed ferry, they tell stories to each other and listen to the 10,000 voices of the forest. And I view myself as a ferryman. I, sit with people, and we go from here to there together and tell our stories.
One story I'd like you to talk about, we take a 2-month respite in the summer, which I was really regretting this summer because there was so much good stuff in this field of ethics. You had run the Ethics and Compliance Officer Association, some 1,200 member firms, the best of the best. Everybody was a chief ethics officer, compliance officer, our members.
Jim Collins, many of you have probably read his trilogy of books. Good to Great was his second. His first was, I'll come up with it in a minute. The first, it was Built to Last. No, you're absolutely right. Built to Last, Good to Great. His third one comes out, How the Mighty Fall. And it's not a great book, by the way. It's not a great book, but the top reason why the mighty fall, he puts, is arrogance. In Good to Great, he said the highest value of a leader is humility. In this successor book, he said it's hubris. It's, I said many times, perfume smells nice, don't drink it. Don't believe it. And you begin to believe.
So what'd you learn this morning? Perfume smells nice.
Yeah, exactly.
Write that down.
Yeah, but you do see that. I mean, what happened to Toyota? Arrogance. I mean, it absolutely did. They felt that they were the market leader. They were, in fact, the market leader. They took it for granted. They forgot what made them the market leader over time. Complaints came in, rather than acting on the complaints, they did what Japanese firms do. They go silent. They live in silos. They don't criticize each other. You don't say no. And so that's, so you get this sense of hubris. It happens all the time. When people speak in a capacity where they sound like they feel they're better than you, that's usually a sign
Let me ask you a question. In your own life, so here you are running the Ethics and Compliance Officer organization. What do you do? What are your own personal habits, your own disciplines to make sure that you're not the next Mark Hurd? I mean, I have that capacity too. What do we all do to make sure that we're not the next? We're sitting up here in these chairs, and but we have feet of clay too. How do you try to avoid your own goals and those things in your life?
Well, from my Catholic upbringing, the notion of eternal damnation kind of stuck. But I've always tried to make good decisions, and I come from a thought, ethics tends to make some people nervous, probably not people in this room, but they see it as a black and white equation, and it's not. There's an awful lot of gray out there. And in the grayness, there are better decisions and there are worse decisions. And I always try and migrate to the better ones and hopefully avoid the worse ones. And when I speak with boards of directors and other top executives, I kind of take the same decision-making process to them, that there's not a whole bunch of perfect answers. My wife teaches math because she says every equation has a perfect answer. She likes that. But I realize the world I live in does not have it. We're human. And so what I try and do is understand that, for starters.
But do you have like a habit or a discipline, be it Sabbath practice or anything like that, or is it more just the way you are?
I have been blessed by being part of a community of people around the world who, as I like to tell us, we had a conference for 600 out in California last week. We are the tree huggers of the world. I mean, ethics and compliance officers want to save the world, and so I feel a great sense of community. In fact, that we believe is at the hallmark of what our association is. And so being in community with those people, and most of whom have the same kind of philosophy that I have about how we should conduct ourselves. Having said that, we see people in our community who don't abide or live by that. But I try and do the right thing. And I have a little invisible filter at the end of the day. Some of you may do the same thing. I've said this for years. I go home every night and it's kind of like, okay, how did I do today? I feel like Ed Koch. How am I doing? Remember Ed Koch and his men? I go through the same thing every night. It's like, how did I do today? What did I achieve? Who did I disappoint? What didn't I fulfill? What do I have to do tomorrow to come back and either correct something that I didn't think was quite right, or improve on something that even may have been right that could be better? And so I kind of go through, it's a nightly discipline that I go through, is just to make sure to keep me the true north, as Bill George would call it, and really think about that. And I've tried hard my whole life. This isn't something that happened when I became much more involved in the ethics field. I tried to do it as a kid too, growing up.
Did you ever have to pay career-wise for taking a higher road stance on an issue?
I, for many years in my career, always carried a letter of resignation in my pocket.
Okay.
It was very liberating. I took it out 3 times. First 2 times I was promoted. And the 3rd time I left. And I remember the 3rd time too. It was I was at a securities firm on Wall Street, and I was reporting to the vice chairman of the board, head of risk management, and he retired, and so I got a word from the CEO that the function I was running, the first ethics office on Wall Street, was going to be transferred to the head of public affairs. And I said, over my dead body. And so, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, here, I'll tell you what I mean. I pick up it and I said, what's this? I said, well, it's my resignation. Are you kidding me? I said, no, I'm just going to date it and sign it. No, you got to go speak to the CEO. He's not, so I go to the CEO. He offers me more money to make this move, and I said, adios. I did the same thing at Marine Midland. And it was offered an opportunity, and it wasn't about money. You can't buy me. The moment you step into that slippery slope, you're done. The moment you make that decision once, you're finished. You'll make it again and again and get deeper and deeper. Most of these scandals don't happen, because somebody sat there and diabolically said, I'm going to do this. Like, you kind of make some decisions, and the next thing you wake up and you're in the middle of the most awful thing that you ever imagined. And somebody caught you. And by the way, you want to get caught? We live in a transparent world. We were talking earlier at the coffee break, and there are no secrets. There's no place to hide. Everybody talks to everybody, fiber optically at the speed of light. And so word gets out there. We don't spin information anymore. You can't. People see through it right away. That's nonsense. That's ridiculous. And so we've got to live our life as if everything we do is on TV or on the front page of the New York Times. We have to. All of our business decisions, we can no longer take for granted that standard operating procedures or business as usual or everybody does it are acceptable standards. They're not. I tell boards, I tell top executives, you have to be introspective about every decision you make and consider how does it affect stakeholders everywhere. You saw the Goldman Sachs hearings, okay? And for 13, 14 hours, the executives said, we're just market makers. We're just doing what our clients tell us. And of course, Carl Levin keeps hammering at them all day long, saying he might have been looking for legal issues, but he was certainly hammering on the ethical issue. He was very clear, he used the word any number of times. But we're just market makers. We're just making financial decisions. We don't care about the human consequences of the decisions. We're just making, they couldn't hear that. That's what they were saying. Now, in another, because there were two conversations going on. One was a Wall Street conversation. That was a correct answer. That's who they are. They're market makers. But there was another conversation going on, which was a political and possibly an ethical one. And so that's what happened here, is they got caught up in that and couldn't hear that they were just saying, we just make financial decisions. And so it was difficult. I think Goldman has learned from that. I think Goldman will obviously rebound and probably make some changes and adjustments in how they can do it. What a wonderful firm. And when I started my foundation in 1989, John Whitehead was on my board, on my advisory board. He was, former CEO of Goldman. And I remember Whitehead saying, and now remember, they were privately held at the time. Big difference. When you're privately held, all the partners know that their reputation is at stake as well as their family fortunes. And so you make decisions one way. And when you're publicly held, in 1999 they went IPO, obviously the world changes because now you have shareholders who are demanding quarterly results. But Whitehead said, when the hostile raiders came along in the 1980s, we decided that we would not support them. We would not underwrite any of their business. We would become the poison pill, the defenders against the hostile raiders, because that was consistent with the values of Goldman Sachs. If any of you go to Brown Brothers Harriman or work there, the partners room in this big stone building, all these roll-top desks sitting around. There's no cubicles or cubby holes or offices where they sequester themselves. Every partner can hear what every other partner says. Brown Brothers Harriman didn't have a problem through this recession. They came out scot-free. Why? Because they knew that their own fortunes and their reputations were combined, were together. And so we have to think like that in the collective.
And it's a challenge to do that if we work in organizations that aren't partnerships, or where you're not the CEO or you're not the owner. How can you be that voice? Be that voice. Let me move into a couple questions. We have a little bit of time from the gathered folks here. But
Sure.
Before we do that, let me ask you one last question. And that's that a lot of people, when I announced to our advisory board that you were going to be our guest, someone said, and I won't mention who it was, Michael, said, ethics, is he going to be boring? But a lot of people think of the ethics officer as the cop,
Right.
as the bad guy or gal, as essentially a lawyer who's trying to play defense and keep you out of jail. But to you, ethics is more of a cultural question. Tell us what you think of as ethics and what your organization tries to do, and then we'll let some questions from our folks.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of thoughts on it. First off, as a former banker for many years, I'm a risk manager at heart. And every day I wake up and try and assess the downside risk. And once I believe I've mitigated or fortified against that, I try and think about what the upside can be. But I am a downside risk manager. I'm conservative by nature. This is who I am. Obviously grew up in the financial business, so financial risk was very much part of my career. Over time, however, having been in this ethics space now for almost 30 years, I've come to realize that reputation risk is at least as great as strategic operating financial risk. That all it takes is a rumor or a hint of an impropriety and you can lose your franchise. A BP stock has gone down $100 billion. A Toyota stock went down $20 billion. The day of the announcement that the SEC sued Goldman Sachs for fraud, it went down $12 billion and ultimately went down $30 billion. So you want to know what your reputation is worth? Every time I speak to a board of directors of a public company, 5 minutes before I go in, I Google up their market cap and I tell them. I spoke to a board 2 weeks ago in New York and I said, does anybody here at the board know what your reputation is worth? They all looked at each other. I said, it's worth $56.2 billion as of 10 minutes ago. it's their market capitalization. So,
And can that work at the personal level or personal?
absolutely, you work your whole lifetime. All it takes is a single violation and you can destroy your career. I mean, think of yourself as a brand. I mean, you work so hard to earn a reputation, hopefully an honest reputation. The danger, as David knows, is sometimes we create a persona of an estranged individual next to us. I want you to know this Keith Darcy. He has a perfect world there. Read my resume. That's, what a wonderful resume I have. But I've just told you about a different life's journey that isn't part of that. Now, that was part of my midlife crisis, was finding a way to align that wounded person with somebody who was still a high performer in the workplace. But people begin to see you as this person, and we then play to that. And so we've got to be careful not to allow ourselves to drink the perfume that people spill on us. We've got to live in the reality of who we are, that sense of authenticity. To your larger question is, how do you make this happen in the workplace and really create that kind of a workplace? The law changed, as we talked about over coffee, in 2004. On November 1st, 2004, the United States Sentencing Commission made some amendments. The law now states, in addition to law compliance, you must have ethics standards and a corporate culture that embraces it. Well, this is interesting. Lawyers, we know what law compliance is. It's non-negotiable. You must check the box. But what are these ethics standards, and what's this corporate culture that you might hold us accountable to? Lest you think people in Washington aren't paying attention to it, they are. Case was settled against Mellon Bank about 3.5 years ago, where the U.S. Attorney for Western Pennsylvania, Mary Beth Buchanan, actually brought in a consulting firm to do a culture assessment before she made her sentencing recommendations. And it was one of several contributing factors that led her not to seek a deferred prosecution agreement against Mellon Bank, that they indeed had a culture that worked. I speak to people at DOJ all the time. We had Greg Andrews, number 3 at the DOJ, with us last week.
Department of Justice.
Department of Justice. Very first thing they do when they go in for an investigation is they look to the issue of pervasiveness. Is this just a rogue situation, and they'll deal with it in that de minimis fashion, or is it pervasive? Is it inculcated in your organization? Is this a behavior that's tolerated or willfully blind by management in looking into it? And that's the language that they use. So my members since 2004 have been doing culture assessments. How do you do a culture assessment? You go out, you do employee surveys or focus groups or both. Employee surveys, there's 2 elements that I think are important. One is the statistical basis. 67% of the people in the organization believe this and that. And that gives you some data to begin with, gives you a baseline if you want to go back and remeasure for progress in the future period. But what I prefer to see are the verbatims, when you give open-ended questions to people. And then when you start to read that 387 people said, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. This company tolerates this. When you read that same kind of comment time and time and time again, you better act on it. And so what you'll discover in any culture assessment is that there are many fine things that people identify as worthy of the organization and to reinforce. By the way, culture drives behavior in organizations. Not programs, not processes, not compliance, not successories up on the wall that have these cute sayings, you know, with pictures of eagles. It's culture. It's culture. All the research in the world says culture drives behavior in organizations. So you'll find the good things, but you'll also find the 2 or 3 bad elements. And then it's going to take you a long time to get rid of the bad. They're like dandelions. If you just step on them, they grow back. God, get those things out of my lawn, will you? But you have to get them by the roots. You got to pull them out by the roots. And so you have to show evidence to your people when there are bad behaviors. You have to have public hangings sometimes. And many companies do that for that state. And people say, we have helplines in organizations. We used to call them hotlines, but we call them helplines now. Give us a call, 1-800-SNITCH, and we'll take care of it. But people want to know. They will call if they know you will act on it and retain their anonymity or their confidentiality. Okay? That is a statement back to the organization. So one of our members, Microsoft, actually quarterly takes the stories that come in, the investigations that are prosecuted, and changes the information to disguise it completely, and then represents it in their newsletter to say, here's something that happened, and here's what we did about it. It's supposed to illuminate. You get people from all over the world. Hey, why did you publish that story about us? And you're like, well, wait a second, it wasn't about you. That was about somebody else in some other part of the world. This happens all the time. But culture is the operative word. You must pay attention to culture and organizational life.
Greg Page, the CEO of Cargill, was one of our guests one time, and Craig has this very same theme. It's all about telling stories to help reinforce and/or change the culture. And they have something called smoke signals. There's a little, now it's all electronic, but it used to be a newsletter they'd send out, same thing. And they had two kind of stories they would tell in the smoke signals. They would take stories where one of their employees had made a mistake, and how it was mishandled and what could be learned from it. Of course, they disguised it, the particularities. But they also had smoke signals of good stories, where an employee, and often a very junior or mid-level employee, stood up against pressures and forces and powers to do the right thing, often the expensive thing, and they wanted to applaud and affirm the good as well as highlight the bad.
My favorite story about corporate culture and legendary stories is FedEx. You know, FedEx every year, what's the brand promise at FedEx? We deliver the package at 10 a.m. So the legendary story at FedEx is snows came to Memphis, Tennessee, where it rarely snows. Planes couldn't fly, so a driver put chains on his trucks, drove through the Appalachian Mountains, and delivered the package. What is the Tom Hanks movie Castaway? Has anybody seen that? It's a 2-hour FedEx commercial, right? Plane goes down the Pacific, he lands on an island with boxes, he grows long hair and a beard. 5 years later, gets a shave and a haircut. What does he do at the end of the movie? I just summarized a 2-hour movie. What does he do at the end of the movie? Delivers the package. Who does he deliver it to? The person wasn't home. So he leaves a note on the package on the front porch. Thank you, this package saved my life. Metaphorically, work gave him meaning. Our job as leaders is to create a space so people find meaning at work, meaning that contributes to some greater good external to us. Because if we don't do that, then people only have a job. They come in at 9, they leave at 5. The leaders always talk about capturing the hearts and minds of people, but we don't usually do that. So how do you capture the hearts? You've got to give people a purpose and a meaning, that they all come to work, that contributes to some greater good external. If everybody understands why we exist, no matter what industry or field or profession you're in, then that's our mission. We have a brand promise. The best companies in the world align a corporate culture to a brand promise. And we've seen that time and again. Southwest Airlines, FedEx, Danone over in Europe. I mean, I could name the companies, but there's not a whole bunch of them that really understand that relationship.
Keith, this has just been terrific. I had a minute ago said I was going to invite questions, but I also just looked at my watch, and we are very diligent about a hard stop at 1:15, and we are at the witching hour. So unfortunately, we won't have the time for public questions. But if you're willing to stay around, those who want to visit and with Keith offline, please do that. Let me just say one thing, and then I'll close this with a word to send you into the marketplace. Just this morning, when we were catching up and debriefing, Keith opens each of his staff meetings with the executive committee and team at his organization. And it's something that maybe we could all do in our own organizations, whether we're the CEO or a mid-level manager or anything. Every meeting he opens with not a prayer or a Bible devotional, that probably wouldn't be suitable in this setting, but he opens by reading your company mission statement.
Vision and values.
Vision and values. Mission, vision. How many of us actually know the mission statement of our company? How many could recite it verbatim, more or less? How many could recite the rest? To open it, that gives a focus. So I applaud you for that.
No, you need to do that. You know, at the end of the day, we need to remind ourselves that we are the moral agents in the world. Unlike the other living species on this planet, the plants, the animals, the insects, and the fish, we come into this world. They know what life prescribes for them. They have a natural order of life. We come into the world, we don't. Right? Our most fundamental task is to discover who are we as an individual and who are we as a community of people, and how do we reconcile those two differences. And because we're under-specialized and undirected as a species, we actually have to fashion a world to live in. So we create families and schools and religions and Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and Marine Corps, each one of which informs us as a social system of what's right and wrong, in and out, good or bad. And what we need to remind ourselves is the only thing that distinguishes us from the other living species on this planet are the gifts of thinking and feeling and the capacity to choose. And the only thing that defines us as distinctly human is that we are a moral being. Not the plants, not the animals, not the insects, and not the fish. We are the ones that make moral choices in this world. If not us, who? I've always said, these are the eyes of the earth, and this is the voice of the earth, and you are the conscience of the earth. So,
well, thank you for being part. How about a round of applause? as is sometimes my custom, if you don't mind, why don't I send you off with a blessing as you go into your places of work. So I send you off to find meaning and purpose. May you find meaning and purpose even when it seems absent. May you also find light amidst places of darkness, and may that light empower you to be bold and courageous even when others aren't. Go in peace and have a great day at work. Thank you again. All right.